Mr. President, the budget, the 2022-23 budget is like all the other budgets this government has introduced over the past 8 years. It is essentially a document of fantasy. And I say it's a document of fantasy because we have consistently seen the budgets produced by this government fail to actually deliver in reality. We see projections over 4 years which are never met. We see commitments made by this government which are never met, year on year on year. The Treasurer has made commitments around the direction of the budget, made commitments around constraints on spending, and he consistently fails to achieve them. In this year's budget, we see probably the most outlandish commitment around spending, because the government is proposing in the budget year to cut expenditure by roughly 10%. Now, in previous years, they've claimed they'd cut spending by 1%, 2%, and have never achieved it. Yet we are to believe that in an election year, this government is going to cut spending by 10% to try and rein in what has been a series of massive deficits. And there is no reason to believe that's going to be achieved. We've seen year after year after year the government unable to hit its own targets, and the suggestion that this year they'll achieve a 10% cut in spending is simply laughable. So as a consequence, the size of government in Victoria has grown and grown and grown. When the government came to office in 2014, government spending as a share of the economy was around 14.4%. Last year, or the year we're about to finish rather, the 21-22 year, it's grown to 19% of gross state product, a massive increase in the size of government in this state. And of course the biggest area we've seen growth has been in the public sector payroll. Just 3 years ago, in 18-19, leading up to the election, the pre-election budget update, Treasury forecast the size of the public sector payroll at $24.9 billion. In the budget for 21-22, that's now $33 billion. In 3 years, a 33% increase in the public sector payroll, which is absolutely unsustainable. We've seen the size of the public service grow enormously in headcount. Central government, the government departments, have grown from 37,900 people in 2015 to 58,000 people by 2021, June 2021. In the broader public sector, outside the core departments, the growth has been from 277,000 people to 345,000 people. And more than 23,000 people were added last year alone. 23,000 additional public sector workers in Victoria in just 12 months. So for the government to now suggest it's going to cut spending by 10% in this year, an election year, is simply unbelievable, absolutely farcical. And of course, because we've been seeing such enormous growth in spending, sustained growth in spending, we've seen a massive blowout in the state's debt profile, in general government net borrowings, which are now forecast to hit $167 billion by the 25-26 financial year. Now, the government likes to say this is funding our infrastructure program. We're borrowing to fund infrastructure. But in reality, Mr. President, when you look more closely at the government's forecasts, you'll see that, in fact, the government has pared back its own spending on infrastructure while continuing to borrow. And the best example of this is to compare last year's budget papers for the 21-22 year, where the Treasurer said infrastructure spending was going to be $24 billion, and as a consequence, net debt was going to increase to $102 billion. This year the figures have been revised, and the infrastructure spend has in fact been cut. Rather than spend the $24 billion on infrastructure that the Treasurer said he would spend, only $18.9 billion is being spent on infrastructure, yet debt is still going to hit $102 billion. So debt continues to rise, even though the spending on infrastructure has been pared back. And of course that is so the debt can fund the ever-growing deficits that we are seeing year on year on year. The governments like to say, it's fine that we're having this additional borrowings. We can afford it we can afford the repayments within the operating statement. We can afford to service that debt over the forward estimates. But of course, as the debt has ramped up from, I think it was $44 billion the year before last to $167 billion in the out years, that debt servicing cost has increased enormously. In 1920, we were only spending about 3.5% of total expenditure on servicing debt. In 25-26, that's going to hit nearly 7% of total spending. And that assumes we don't have increases in borrowing costs. We don't have increases in interest rates. So we're going from 3.5% of total spend just to pay the interest bill to 7% just to pay the interest bill in 6 short years without allowing for interest rate rises. In fact, that assumes an interest rate of borrowing cost of around 4% consistently as the debt profile rises. And we've seen already this week a very substantial increase in the cash rate as a consequence of the decision of the Reserve Bank on Tuesday, which raised the cash rate to 0.85%. So we've gone from 0.1% to 0.85% in just on a month, with other rises expected, and that's going to flow through to government bonds. So it's highly questionable whether the government can constrain its borrowing cost at the same level over the forward estimates period when other borrowing costs in Australia and around the world are rising. And if that is not the case, if we see those borrowing costs rise, then the forecast 7% of total spending to service our debt is going to increase rapidly. And that either means we'll have bigger deficits in the future, or government is going to have to pare back on spending, something it has consistently failed to do despite its claims that it would. Now, we talk about the budget and we talk about what the government is spending, but we can't look at that in isolation. We need to also look at what this budget means and what the government's economic settings mean for the broader Victorian economy. What are the policy settings, what are the economic objectives the government has put in place to drive the Victorian economy? And we've seen the economy in Victoria has been in long-term decline. Over the last 20 years, and I point out that the Labor government has been in office for 19 of the last 23 years, we've seen Victoria's share of national output decline. Back in 1999, Victoria accounted for 25%, a bit over 25% of total national output in this country. Last year, 2021, that had declined to just under 23%. So while we're still about 25% of the national population, we no longer produce 25% of national output. We're only producing about 23% of national output. And we've seen over that period of time, productivity growth in this state stagnate. And the reality, Mr. President, productivity is the only game in town if we want to improve the living standards of the Victorian population. Over the last decade, productivity growth in Australia has been poor. It's only been about 7% in total over the last decade. And much of that's been driven by resources in Western Australia. We've seen population growth in Australia, we've seen population growth in Victoria, which has driven economic growth, but it's actually masked the fact that we've had no real productivity growth, therefore no real improvement in standard of living. Over the last decade, New South Wales has managed to generate productivity growth of a bit under 7%, and in Victoria it's been just half of 1%. So effectively no real improvement in productivity and no real improvement in standard of living. And that's simply not sustainable. If we want to improve the lives of Victorian citizens, we need to get productivity growth moving in this state. And of course, one of the big drivers of that is going to be investment, getting the private sector to invest in this state. And we've seen in recent years Victoria fall further and further behind New South Wales as we have an environment which is less friendly to investment, an environment which is more complex to invest, regulatory burden is greater, tax burden is greater. It's a disincentive for investment. And consequently, last year when I spoke about this point, I referred to the fact that investment, private sector investment in Victoria was $12 billion lower than in New South Wales. This year, the latest set of data from the ABS shows that gap has blown out from $12 billion to now more than $16.5 billion. So in the year to June 2021, New South Wales was able to attract more than $16.5 billion more in private sector investment than Victoria did. In Victoria's case, we attracted a bit under $48 billion of private sector investment. New South Wales, nearly $65 billion. And that differential is going to mean the differential in living standard between Victoria and New South Wales is going to continue to grow. Last year, it was around $8,000 per person. New South Wales generated $8,000 more in output per person than Victoria, and that reflects the standard of living. And if we continue to fall behind New South Wales in attracting investment, that differential is going to grow between our two states. Victoria will fall further and further behind, and of course we will see the best and brightest leave Victoria. We've already seen that in the last 2 years. We've seen our population growth plummet. We were growing at around 1.8% per annum in population year on year prior to COVID. That has dropped away. We've had population shrink, and it's continuing to shrink. The best and brightest are leaving Victoria, and that's going to have long-term consequences. And unless we get the policy settings right, unless we get the budget settings right, create an environment which actually attracts investment and attracts talent, we're going to see Victoria fall further and further behind. The last 2 years have demonstrated that Australia's been caught napping. Not just Victoria, but Australia as a whole. And we've seen fractured supply chains, we've seen shortages in imports, we've seen our export markets challenged, particularly where we've had high concentrations in some destinations, and now we're seeing that situation become worse. What was bubbling along as the early stages of inflation a year ago, some shortages in some areas have now turned into major shortages in all sorts of areas across the economy, and of course massive price rises. And that situation is only going to become worse. We're seeing our fuel situation very difficult. Last year, the federal government decided to back in the 2 fuel refineries which remain in Australia, down from 7 previously, to provide some element of fuel security, but of course that is limited and short-term. And earlier this year, in February, we actually saw a shortage of avgas on the east coast of Australia. With the shutdown, a maintenance-related shutdown of the refinery at Geelong, we saw bowsers across eastern Australia start to run out of avgas. And it was within only 24 hours between the plant reopening after an extended, I think it was about a 14-day shutdown, but bowsers were running dry. And it was only at the last minute that fuel supply was restored. And that highlights the challenge we have with fuel in Australia and the challenge we will continue to have with fuel in Australia. Likewise with energy. We're seeing now the consequences of energy policy in this state. I've talked previously around how the government's energy policies are going to ensure in summer we have a shortage of power, and in winter we have a shortage of gas. And we've been seeing that in the last couple of weeks, as we've had a particularly cold period of weather. Now, it's fine for the government to have a policy of shifting to renewable energy. It's not fine to have no transition plan. And that's what we've seen. A policy platform which has discouraged investment and continued maintenance in existing infrastructure, be it coal power generation in the Latrobe Valley, be it gas reserves, gas supply in a transition phase, and consequently we are now in a situation of critical energy shortages where we shouldn't have. In a nation which has so much energy resources, we should not be in a situation where we are struggling to get gas supply, and in summer we are struggling for electricity supply. So, Mr. President, this budget does not contain the vision and the direction to meet the challenges that Victoria faces. It is a budget with some very dubious numbers, which consistently year on year the government has not been able to meet in the past. We have no confidence that it will deliver the 10% cut in spending it claims it will deliver in an election year, but most importantly, it doesn't have the vision, it doesn't have the direction to meet the challenges Victoria faces in this century.